So picture this. It is 11:58 p.m. You are staring at this glaring white light of your computer screen. Your assignment is due at exactly 11:59 p.m. and like your heart is pounding so hard you can actually hear it in your ears.
Oh yeah, we've all been there.
Right. You are typing like an absolute maniac, just ignoring typos, praying your Wi-Fi doesn't blink out on you. And then finally, you hit submit. The clock ticks over to midnight.
Barely made it.
Exactly. You slump back in your chair, totally exhausted, and you swear to yourself, you're like, never again. I am never, ever doing this to myself again.
But spoiler alert here.
You do. We all do. And welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to decode the ultimate student nemesis, which is academic procrastination. We're pulling from some really great sources today, an analysis from Verywell Mind, and a deep dive from the University of Melbourne student magazine, Farrago.
Yeah, those are fantastic sources because they really get into the weeds of why we do this to ourselves.
They really do, because, for the longest time, the narrative has just been that if you pull this kind of stunt, you're simply lazy, like you lack discipline or you just don't care about your education.
Right, which is honestly the biggest, most destructive myth about academic procrastination out there.
They're really the biggest myth.
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the psychological research from our sources, procrastination is, it's not a time management issue at all. It's fundamentally a failure of self-regulation and mood management.
Wait, mood management.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because laziness implies apathy, right? It implies you genuinely do not care about the outcome. But procrastinators usually care intensely.
Which is why they're so stressed out.
Precisely. They're in this state of high stress. So
Yeah.
what is actually happening is this inability to process and manage negative emotions, like the anxiety, the profound boredom, the crippling self-doubt that a specific task triggers.
Oh, I see. So you aren't really avoiding the history essay itself.
No, you are avoiding the intense negative feelings that the history essay brings up for you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I feel like we tell ourselves we're just waiting to feel inspired, like
Right.
we wait to get into the right mood to write that paper or study for that exam.
Right, the classic, I'm just not in the zone yet excuse.
Exactly. But I always think of that as like waiting for a lightning strike to power your laptop.
That is a great way to put it.
Because it's totally unpredictable. It leaves you completely helpless, and you are just sitting there in the dark hoping the universe decides to charge your battery instead of just, plugging the thing into the wall and turning on the power.
Yeah, you're literally handing over your agency to a feeling that may never arrive. And to understand why we willingly sabotage ourselves like this, we have to look at the evolutionary biology behind it. There's this psychological concept called present bias.
Present bias. Okay, what is that exactly?
So to a modern student, putting off an essay seems totally irrational. But to the primitive part of the human brain, it makes perfect sense.
Because our brains are hardwired to prioritize immediate rewards over long-term benefits.
Yes, exactly. It's through a mechanism called temporal discounting. Think about early human survival.
Like hunter-gatherer days.
Right. For a hunter-gatherer, a guaranteed meal right now was infinitely more valuable than the promise of maybe finding food next week.
Because you might not survive until next week.
Exactly. We evolved to deeply discount the value of any reward the further away it is in time. So when you're sitting in bed, the immediate reward of watching just one more episode of a show, that's a guaranteed instant hit of dopamine.
It satisfies that primal drive for immediate gratification.
You got it. While the long-term benefit of starting your assignment, which, might lead to a good grade in 3 weeks, that feels entirely abstract to your primitive brain.
So my brain is basically doing primitive math. Like TV feels good now, essay feels bad now. It's just an immediate pleasure versus delayed pain calculation.
The math is brutal, but efficient. And this present bias, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is fueled by these massive cognitive distortions.
Distortions like what?
Well, the sources point out that an estimated 75% of students admit to regular procrastination.
Wow, 75%. That's huge.
Right. And they're all falling into the exact same mental traps. We consistently overestimate how much time we have left before a deadline. We wildly underestimate how long a complex task will actually take to complete.
Oh, I do that all the time.
We all do.
Oh.
And perhaps most dangerously, we overestimate how motivated we will feel in the future.
Oh, man. I actually call this the time traveler's delusion.
The time traveler's delusion. I like that.
Yeah, it's this bizarre mental gymnastics we do where we trick ourselves into believing that future you is somehow going to wake up tomorrow as this, like, highly motivated, hyper-focused superhero.
Right, someone who is totally capable of writing 2,000 flawless words in a single hour.
Exactly. Meanwhile, present you just wants to scroll through social media and eat cereal. We basically take all of our present-day responsibilities and just dump them onto this imaginary, perfected version of ourselves who only exists tomorrow,
And then tomorrow arrives and future you is just present you again.
still wanting to scroll through social media.
Yeah, but now operating under intense panic.
Okay.
And this triggers a really vicious psychological loop.
What kind of loop?
Well, the moment you decide to put off the essay, you feel a tiny prick of guilt. And guilt is a negative emotion. So what does your brain immediately crave to soothe a negative emotion?
Dopamine.
Exactly. Dopamine. So you open an app or turn on a video game to get that quick dopamine hit to numb the guilt,
But the distraction wastes more time,
which creates more guilt.
which demands more dopamine.
Yes, you
waste.
aren't just delaying the work. You are actively digging a deeper emotional hole.
Okay, so if 75% of students are trapped in this dopamine guilt spiral, they can't all be doing it for the exact same underlying reason, right? Like,
Uh,
the avoidance has to take different shapes depending on the person's baseline personality.
Oh, for sure. The shape of the avoidance absolutely changes. Researcher Linda Sapadin outlines several distinct profiles of procrastinators in this space.
Profiles. Okay, break those down for me.
Let's contrast three of the most common ones to see how this plays out in, like, a dorm room setting. There's the perfectionist, the defier, and the crisis maker.
Okay, the perfectionist sounds pretty self-explanatory, but how does that cause procrastination?
Well, the perfectionist is driven purely by anxiety. They are just paralyzed by the need for flawlessness. Their subconscious logic dictates that their self-worth is tied entirely to the quality of their output.
So they're terrified of messing up.
Exactly. They won't start the assignment because they fear the first draft won't meet their impossibly high self-imposed standards. By not starting, they protect their ego from the reality of a less than perfect effort.
Oh, I know that person. They spend like 4 hours organizing their highlighters, perfectly formatting the title page, and researching obscure fonts.
But they haven't written a single sentence of the actual paper.
Exactly. Okay, so that is the perfectionist in action. What about the defier?
Now, contrast that with the defier, who is driven by frustration and resentment rather than anxiety.
Frustration at who?
At the system, mostly. The defier is essentially the rebel of the academic world. They deeply resent having a schedule dictated to them by a professor, a syllabus, or an institution.
So they rebel by not doing the work.
Right. For them, delaying the work is a subconscious way of reclaiming their autonomy. They drag their feet to prove that they are in control of their own time, even if it ultimately harms their grade.
Wow, cutting off your nose to spite your face. What about the third one, the crisis maker? Because that sounds like the person pulling the 11:58 p.m. submission we talked about at the beginning.
Spot on. The crisis maker is fascinated by the edge. This is the student who holds a deeply ingrained, almost superstitious belief that they actually need extreme stress to perform at their best.
Like they convince themselves they only do their best work under pressure.
Exactly. So they artificially manufacture an emergency by waiting until the night before to start a massive project just to trigger that adrenaline rush.
Okay, hold on. I have to push back on these neat little categories for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
If I'm a student, I might feel like a perfectionist on Monday when I'm tackling a major essay for my core major, right?
Makes sense.
But by Thursday, when I'm facing some tedious general education requirement, I might completely mutate into a defier just because I'm exhausted and resent the busy work. Human behavior just isn't this rigid.
That's a fair point. But you are confusing an underlying emotional driver with a temporary situational reaction.
Oh, how so?
Sapadin's research isn't trying to lock you into a single astrological sign of procrastination where you only ever act one way. The nuance here is that your dominant response mechanism usually defaults to one of these camps when you are under severe, prolonged stress.
So it's about what you do when the pressure is really on.
Exactly. Yes, you might act like a defier for a throwaway assignment, but when the stakes are genuinely high, like a final thesis, your core behavioral profile takes over.
Okay, I see.
If you are a true perfectionist, that thesis will paralyze you. If you are a true crisis maker, you will still wait until the last possible second to write the thesis, specifically to trigger the adrenaline rush.
So understanding your primary profile is about recognizing the specific flavor of your avoidance.
Right, especially in high-stakes situations, so you can intercept it before it escalates.
Well, if our brains are so highly evolved, why would a crisis maker actively choose to trigger a massive stress response just to write an essay? Like, what is that manufactured panic actually doing to the body over 4 years of college?
The toll is catastrophic over the long term, honestly. Let's look at a highly influential study conducted in 1997 by Roy Baumeister and Diane Tice.
Okay, what did they do?
This wasn't just a quick survey. They tracked a cohort of procrastinators and non-procrastinators over the course of an entire academic semester. And the day-to-day findings were incredibly revealing.
I bet. What did they find out early on?
Well, early in the semester, the procrastinators actually reported significantly lower stress levels than the non-procrastinators.
Really? Because they weren't working it.
Exactly. They were socializing, relaxing, essentially enjoying the immediate dopamine rewards of present bias.
Ignorance is bliss until midterms hit.
And that is exactly when the data shifted violently. By the end of the semester, the hammer dropped. Not only did the procrastinators' stress levels absolutely skyrocket as deadlines crashed down on them, but when researchers tallied the cumulative stress for the entire semester, the procrastinators' overall stress was double that of the non-procrastinators.
Double. Wow.
Yeah, and it goes beyond just feeling overwhelmed emotionally. Chronic procrastination is linked to serious, tangible physical health issues.
Like what kind of issues?
The research links it to an increase in acute illnesses, severe hypertension, and eventually cardiovascular disease.
Wait, cardiovascular disease from putting off a term paper. How does that mechanism even work?
It comes down to how your body processes chronic stress. When you constantly push right up against high-stakes deadlines, you are repeatedly activating your body's fight-or-flight response.
So your adrenaline is just constantly spiking.
Right. Your adrenal glands pump out cortisol and adrenaline. In a true survival situation, those hormones dissipate once you escape the physical threat.
Like running from a bear.
Exactly. But when the threat is a looming deadline that you are actively avoiding for weeks, your body stays in a prolonged state of heightened physiological alert.
Oh, man. So you never cool down.
Never. That chronic cortisol exposure keeps your blood pressure elevated, which over time causes micro tears in the lining of your blood vessels. You are essentially bathing your cardiovascular system in corrosive stress hormones just to avoid doing the work.
Yikes. But here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because as much as it might ruin our cardiovascular health, the sources highlight a genuinely surprising silver lining to all of this.
Oh, yes. The active versus passive distinction.
Right. And it hinges on a distinction made by researchers Choi and Chu between what they call passive procrastination and active procrastination.
Yeah, and that distinction completely reframes the conversation around delay.
So break that down. What's the difference?
Well, passive procrastinators are the ones paralyzed by indecision and negative emotions. They don't want to delay, they know they are hurting themselves, but they are stuck in that guilt dopamine loop.
Right, the ones scrolling on their phones while feeling terrible about it.
Exactly. But active procrastinators intentionally and deliberately postpone their work. They know they thrive under pressure,
Yeah.
they maintain strict control over their schedule, and they use the impending deadline as a deliberate psychological tool to sharpen their focus.
And if we look at the Adam Grant TED Talk mentioned in the sources, alongside the 2017 study by Liu and colleagues, they found a fascinating link between this active procrastination and elevated creativity.
Yes, the creativity boost is real.
Because if you are deliberately putting off an essay, your brain doesn't just delete the prompt, right? It acts like a complex computer program running quietly in the background.
Precisely. While you're folding laundry, going for a walk, or cooking dinner, your subconscious is churning through the material.
Right. It's making novel connections and intubating ideas that you almost certainly wouldn't have discovered if you had just sat down and forced yourself to churn out a linear draft the very minute the professor assigned it.
The psychological term for that is divergent thinking.
Divergent thinking. I love that.
Yeah, the active delay gives your brain the necessary space to wander, to gather disparate pieces of information from your environment, and to let them marinate. So when you finally sit down to write under the pressure of the deadline, you have a much richer, more nonlinear pool of ideas to draw from.
That almost makes me want to procrastinate right now.
I know, it sounds great, but, and this is a massive caveat that the research emphasizes, what active procrastination might boost creativity and innovation for a specific subset of people, the physiological toll remains.
Right, the chronic cortisol and hypertension we just talked about?
Exactly. It remains a highly dangerous game to play over the span of an entire college career or professional life.
Because at the end of the day, no one wants to induce a heart attack at 22 just to write a slightly more creative history paper.
Definitely not.
So even with the potential creative benefits of active procrastination, the physical toll makes it clear we need to figure out how to stop the cycle. How do we actually intervene when we are stuck in the passive, paralyzing form of avoidance?
What is genuinely fascinating here is that the most effective tool to combat this isn't found in a productivity app or like a color-coded calendar.
No. What is it then?
It is actually the most counterintuitive approach imaginable. Self-compassion.
Self-compassion.
Really?
Yes, really.
Because when I'm blowing off a major assignment, my instinct is that I need militant discipline. I feel like I need a drill sergeant screaming at me to get to work, not a warm hug.
I know. And that instinct is exactly what perpetuates the cycle of avoidance. Research by Fuchsia Siro specifically examines this mechanism.
What did her research show?
Her data shows that people who chronically procrastinate naturally exhibit significantly lower levels of self-compassion. Think about your inner monologue when you realize you've wasted 4 hours on your phone.
Oh, it's brutal. I'm so mean to myself.
Right. You turn vicious, you beat yourself up, you call yourself lazy, you panic about your future. But remember the baseline definition. Procrastination is a failure of mood management.
So by being mean, I'm just making my mood worse. Exactly. By treating yourself harshly, you artificially spike your own stress and anxiety levels. You are literally generating the exact negative emotions that caused you to flee from the task in the first place. You trap yourself in a self-fulfilling prophecy of stress and avoidance.
Man, that makes so much sense. So what does this all mean practically if a listener is sitting there right now listening to this deep dive while actively avoiding a paper? How do they deploy self-compassion in a way that actually gets the paper written?
Step 1 is to actively forgive yourself for the time you have already wasted.
Just let it go.
Yes. You have to acknowledge that the procrastination happened, drop the heavy baggage of guilt, and emotionally reset. Once you neutralize the shame, you have to bypass the brain's overwhelm mechanism.
And how do we do that?
You do this by breaking the task down into microscopic, almost absurdly small baby steps. You do not put write 2,000-word essay on your to-do list. That is an abstract monster.
So what do you put instead?
You put create Google Doc and type my name. You put find 3 academic sources. You give each of those tiny stages, the planning, the drafting, the editing, its own personal, low-stakes due date.
Just keeping it super manageable.
Exactly. And critically, you have to engineer your environment to eliminate specific digital distractions. If TikTok is your kryptonite, you don't just rely on sheer willpower to ignore it.
Because willpower runs out.
Right. Willpower is a finite resource that depletes rapidly when you are stressed. You physically place the phone in another room, or you install a site blocker. You must lower the barrier to entry for the actual work while simultaneously raising the barrier to entry for the distraction.
I really want to focus on that idea of lowering the barrier, especially for the perfectionist profile we discussed earlier.
Oh yes, they struggle with this the most.
Because the sources mention an incredible concept to combat this, which they call the awful first draft rule.
I love this rule.
Me too. If you are paralyzed because your anxiety demands that your writing be brilliant right out of the gate, you need to actively commit to writing something terrible. You literally tell yourself, I am going to write the absolute worst paragraph in the history of the English language right now.
It takes all the pressure off.
It really does. But I have to ask, how does a listener actually force themselves to take that very first baby step when their anxiety is just screaming at them to stop? Like, telling an anxious perfectionist to just write poorly feels a bit like telling someone with the fear of heights to just jump off a diving board. It's a lot easier said than done.
You are absolutely right, which is why simply telling an anxious person to write poorly usually fails. The perfectionist's brain will still resist the output.
So what's the workaround?
To override that intense resistance, you don't focus on the quality of the work at all. You focus entirely on the duration of the exposure.
The jury.
Yes. You utilize a technique involving micro-commitments. When the anxiety is peaking, you negotiate with your primitive brain. You say, I am not going to write an essay. I am only going to sit at this specific desk, look at this document, and type whatever comes to mind for exactly 5 minutes.
Just 5 minutes.
Just 5 minutes. And you tell yourself, when the timer goes off, if the anxiety is still unbearable, I give myself full permission to stop and walk away.
Ah, so you give yourself a psychological out.
Precisely. You drastically reduce the perceived threat of the task. What the clinical data shows is that starting is almost always the highest friction point.
It's just getting over that initial hurdle.
Exactly. Once you are in motion, once your fingers are physically moving and that awful first sentence is actually on the page, the paralyzing anxiety begins to dissipate. The task is no longer this abstract, terrifying monster looming in your imagination. It is just words on a screen.
Right. Action precedes motivation. You don't wait for motivation to strike to take action. You take a tiny, manageable action to generate the motivation.
Beautifully said.
You don't sit in the dark waiting for the lightning strike. You just plug the laptop in, even if the screen is dim at first.
Exactly. And if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, what the psychological research from Farrago and Variable Mind is really telling us is that managing your academic workload has very little to do with managing your time.
Because we already know how to tell time.
Right, you understand how a calendar functions. Managing your workload is entirely about managing your emotions. It is about developing the self-awareness to recognize when you feel insecure, profoundly bored, or terrified of failing.
And then knowing how to handle it.
Yeah, having the emotional maturity and self-forgiveness to gently steer yourself back to the work one tiny step at a time.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It completely removes the shame from the equation, taking us from a place of I'm lazy to I'm overwhelmed and that's okay.
It changes everything.
It really does. And as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought.
Oh, this is a good one.
It's something that jumped out from the margins of these sources that we really need to sit with. The research notes that chronic procrastination is heavily linked to underlying mental health conditions.
Things like ADHD, depression, and OCD.
Exactly. And these are conditions defined by genuine neurodivergence and severe emotional dysregulation. So, if so much of what we casually dismiss as academic procrastination is actually tied to the way a student's brain is fundamentally chemically wired.
Right, it begs a huge question.
It does. Is our education system, which relies almost entirely on rigid, high-stakes, uncompromising deadlines, structurally failing students who simply process the world differently?
Are we punishing them for a failure of self-regulation when the academic system itself offers absolutely no room for neurodivergent pacing?
It's definitely something to ponder before your next deadline. But whatever you do, remember, don't wait for the lightning strike. Take the first awful step. See you next time.